Hello, 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 and welcome to the June edition of the ISC Squared Miami Cybersecurity Lightning Labs. My name is AJ Yawn. I'm the Education Chair of the ISC Squared Miami chapter. I'm an AWS Certified Solutions Architect Professional, CISSP, and a number of other AWS certifications. So, really excited to chat with you all about this key security misconfiguration. So a few weeks ago, I had a speaking engagement with a security awareness training company, and one of the members that I was speaking to asked me what keeps me up at night as a cloud security professional. I thought it was a really great question, and the first thing that popped to mind were S3 buckets. And that may sound weird, but it's really because this is something that you constantly see in the news where S3 buckets are continually being used to breach organizations and to harm organizations and to secure sensitive data that should not be made public and should not be available to people outside of that particular organization. So I talked about that, and I talked about the reason why it bothers me is because it's preventable. There's a number of services, whether on AWS or third-party tools or even custom tools that you can create to stop these leaky buckets from occurring. So after that session a few weeks ago, it kind of felt like when you first start looking for a new car and you start to see that car all the time out in the public. I started to see all these articles about S3 breaches popping up, and a reminder of all the organizations that have been breached by S3 buckets in the past. Organizations such as Walmart, FedEx, the Republican National Committee, Dow Jones, Verizon. The list is just insane, the amount of organizations that have been impacted by this key security misconfiguration. So I decided to create a lab. I decided to create a lab to help security professionals understand one way that they can automate the security of their S3 buckets. And this lab is really only going to explain one way of doing this. There obviously are a number of other ways or tools that you can utilize, but in this session, we're going to specifically walk through how to set this up in the AWS console with key AWS services. Now, just a quick refresher, S3 stands for Simple Storage Service. It's an object storage on AWS that allows organizations to store sensitive data like documents, pictures, videos, and other things that you would normally see in a web application. S3 is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, AWS service. It's used by organizations of all sizes, and oftentimes it's the first entry point for an organization into the cloud. Is they'll start to use the storage service and then expand into other services as they begin to move their computing resources onto the cloud. So and like I mentioned above, it's the cause of a lot of data breaches. So hopefully this lab allows you to shore up one potential vulnerability and move on to the next one. So as you can see on the screen here, what our goal is to stop leaky buckets and then also encrypt them at rest. The way that we'll do this is by using AWS config, which is a service that continuously monitors and records resources in your account. And it uses AWS rules to assess compliance against predefined security configurations. So with AWS config, you're going to go out and check your bucket compliance or other resources compliance against these rules that you can define, or you can use the preset managed AWS rules, which right now there's about 94 of those AWS config pre-managed or managed rule sets. And these rules check compliance with things such as public write or read access on AWS, or whether or not the buckets are encrypted at rest. And what you're going to do is you're going to use AWS config service to assess this compliance. It's going to record the compliance status utilizing Lambda functions. And if the status comes back as non-compliant, you can use AWS config auto remediation to go ahead and remediate those security misconfigurations. And AWS config auto remediation uses Systems Manager, which is a visibility and infrastructure control management service, and it uses that to go out and correct those security misconfigurations. So using the power of AWS config here, you can identify a security hole. You can also have some notifications, as you can see here on the bottom of the screen, where AWS config can publish statuses to an SNS topic, which can be subscribed to via email, where you can get these notifications, or you can integrate with AWS chatbot, which allows you to get these notifications in Slack. So your team members can get notified right in the tool that they're using when resources change compliance status. which is important, right? You want to know when things are going wrong. So this service and this lab will hopefully be able to take an S3 bucket, which is a key resource in your account. You can identify whether or not it's compliant with your current company's security configuration requirements. You can notify your users when the compliance status changes, and then you can ultimately fix it all without while you're in your bed or at the beach or at the pool or whatever it may be. So let's go ahead and hop into the console and walk through this lab and really explain how this will work. So as with all things in AWS, you need to ensure that the service or user you want to perform a particular action has IAM policies associated with it. Everything on AWS requires an explicit allow. This is no different with AWS config and AWS systems manager as well. So first you can see here is that we have this AWS service role for config, and if I click in here, you'll see that I just have this AWS managed policy, which is denoted by this box here next to the policy name, which we won't dive into because that's public information that you can go find and see exactly what that does. The SSM Leaky buckets role is another role that we have to have created here for this particular lab. And this role has this Amazon SSM automation role, which is AWS managed role, again denoted by that box that's next to the policy name. Next, we have this pass role function, which allows a service to later assume this role on behalf of systems manager. So it's able to pass this role to other services on behalf of systems manager. And this is useful when you're using multiple services to go out and perform some of these auto remediation functions. You don't want to have to create new roles and new permissions for each of those services. It can use this pass role function to do that for you. And then lastly, for this lab, if we were going out and remediating EC2 instances by performing updates, we would need to have permissions for this role to go out and do this. But this is an S3 lab, so the only permissions that I have here are the S3 full permissions, which this is a little bit more granular. I could have just performed a full admin policy here, but what I did is create this S3 full access role to show you that this is specifically for S3. Now, in a real production environment, I would follow the principles of least privilege and make sure that these permissions that are listed here are only the ones that are necessary for config to perform. So for the case of this lab, it would be only for for this role to disable public and read-write access on the bucket ACLs, as well as enable encryption on those buckets as well. But for the ease of this lab, we went ahead and just added full access. So let's hop over to S3 and take a look at what we have set up here. And you'll see a few buckets set up, and we're really only going to worry about the buckets in the US East 1 region, this North Virginia region, and that's important because AWS config is a regional service, which means it's only going to go out and find resources in its particular region. Now, you can set up AWS config using AWS organizations or some of the other features like a AWS config rule aggregator to capture AWS config compliance status across multiple accounts and across multiple regions. But for the sake of this lab, we're only focusing on the regional foundational service of AWS config. So the first thing that you'll notice on these S3 buckets is that they're all not public, or except these objects can be public, but the ones in US East 1, the bucket and the objects are not public. So we're going to go ahead and make that change as at this current organization, this Leaky bucket organization, the policy is that no buckets or objects should be made public in the US East 1 region. And we're going to make this change that is against company policy. So one real thing, quick thing you can see is how easy it is for me to change this. But AWS does ask you, do you really want to do this? Do you really want to make these objects and the buckets public? And it make you type in confirm to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and confirm that I want to perform this misconfiguration. And as you can see here, those buckets are starting to pop up public, denoted there by that public icon. I'm also going to go ahead and remove default encryption on these 4 buckets. And as I'm doing this, you can, if you're not familiar with AWS or you have not poked around on the console, you can really see how easy it is to change configurations on resources. So this has all taken me about less than a minute to change 4 different buckets permissions from having private access to the information located in these buckets, as well as removing the encryption associated with these 4 buckets. So we now have 4 buckets in the US East 1 region that I made public, as well as removed default encryption. So let's pop over to AWS config, and again, we want to make sure we're in the right region. So we're in the North Virginia region, which is perfect. And one thing you'll immediately notice is that we do have these 3 rules set up, and you can see that on the dashboard as well over here, that the config rule compliance and the resource compliance. And there is a little bit of a delay between when an action was performed in AWS and what's reported in this dashboard. When things change from compliant to non-compliant, the auto remediation kicks in, and it's actually going to go out and fix the issue before you're going to see the reporting change in the dashboard. And that's just a little weird thing with AWS, but it's good to know that the actual remediation is taking place, even if the reporting is a little bit delayed. So what you'll see here is we have these 3 rules set up, and they're in a compliant status right now, and you can see that we have remediation actions already set in place for each of these rules. So to make sure that you have the full picture of how to set this up, we're going to pop over to a different region, because again, remember that AWS config is a regional service. So if I just popped over to the Africa Cape Town region, let's just go to a different region. I didn't realize that I had to set something up here, and I don't want to waste time reading through that. So we'll pop over to the EU West 2 region. I actually might have config set up here. Okay, I don't, which is great. So as you can see, when you pop over to a new region, it's going to be like you've never used config before, and you have to go through the initial setup, which doesn't take long. So let's really quick go through this. First, you'll see what are the resources that we want to record, and you want to always click include global resources so that it picks up these IAM resources, which are considered global resources. So again, AWS config is a regional based service, which is why you need to select that. Next, you will decide which Amazon S3 bucket you would like the configuration history and snapshot files to go to. And what I'll do here is just create a unique named bucket so that we don't get any errors here. All S3 buckets have to be globally unique, which is why I just typed that, because there was a bucket previously created under this account with that same name. So stream configuration changes and notification to an Amazon SNS topic. This is what we were talking about on the slide deck there, where you're able to send notifications to SNS, Amazon Simple Notification Service. And the way that you can set this up is you can create a new topic, or you can choose an existing topic from your account, which SNS is also regional. So the topic I've created in US East 1 will not pop up here, but we'll take a look at it here in a second. And what you can do with this, with the new AWS chatbot service, is send this directly to Slack. A number of organizations use Slack for their instant messaging service, which allows for communication between your administrators and development teams and all kinds of security teams as well. And it's a great service. And imagine being able to have AWS communicate directly with you in Slack about status updates regarding configurations in your environment. So really quick, we'll take a look at the chatbot console. Really simple to set up. You can set up your Slack by just finding your Slack workspaces, configuring that really quickly, which is not hard. You can configure different channels to receive notifications. So if I click configure new channel, I would just name it. I would choose which channel I want to configure. IAM rule stuff, that's pretty straightforward. And then I can choose whatever SNS topic I want to subscribe to. So in the US East 1 region, I have the AWS config topic. I could subscribe to this region and have it sent to whatever channel I want. And any updates from that AWS config updates, so any compliant versus non-compliant statuses, would pop up in Slack. So if we take a look over at Slack here, you can see some of these example notifications that I have here from this account, where you see AWS config is the service, the region is US East 1, and then the account number, see the message type, and then all kinds of inventory data, finishing up with the most important, what is the compliance type status here. So pretty cool feature for you to use and enable notification from config to Slack and give you a good amount of information related to the status of your AWS config rules. So we'll use an existing AWS config service link role, and remember that's the role that we viewed there in the console when we first got started. All right, so like I mentioned before, AWS has a set of managed rules, and these AWS config rules can check the configuration of your resources against these rule sets. So if we just take a look at S3, we have these S3 bucket public read, public write, and then if I click next, we'll see the S3 bucket server-side encryption enabled. So we'll select those three rules just like we have in the US East 1 region. So you see here on the review side, we have all resources, including global resources. We're sending the details of this config, snapshots, and resource history to this bucket. We have the service role set up, and then here are the three rules that we have configured in this environment. So we'll go ahead and confirm this, and you can see it's pretty easy to set up AWS config. It doesn't take a lot, and you're only paying for really minor fees for the resource items that they're reaching out and touching. So I would definitely encourage you to take a look at the pricing, which you can see down here in the bottom left, that describes how much this costs, but it's not a huge uplift financially. So really quick, you can see the rules are going out. They're trying to discover if there's any resources, and the difference between here and US East 1 is we haven't set up any remediation. So if we were setting this up from scratch, we would click edit. You would see here at the top, this is the name of the rule. Here's the description of what the rule is actually going to do. And then we get into some of the configuration details that I wanted to make sure you all are aware of. So on the trigger type, you're going to see that this is involving configuration changes or periodic changes, and that's really simple. It's either when something changes on the actual resource or at a pre-specified time, which you set down here in the frequency window, which can be anywhere between 1 hour and in different increments all the way up to 24 hours. You can narrow down the scope. So if you're using a pretty robust tagging strategy, you can say you only want the resources that are tagged prod with the key PII, which can allow you to really narrow down where this rule set applies. And tagging is definitely recommended on AWS. You'll be able to choose your remediation action, which this is where we're using that AWS Systems Manager role that I showed you in IAM earlier. And there's a series of remediation actions that you'll be able to use depending on the rule set that you're using. And you can see here some pretty powerful ones. But what we'll do here is we'll choose AWS disable S3 bucket public read write as our remediation action. We'll choose that we want this to be auto remediated. How many times we want it to retry in a 60-second time period. We can set rate limits, and then the resource ID parameter. So what you want to do here is select S3 bucket name as the dynamic parameter, which is going to pull every time we evaluate the rules and get those resources that are in scope. And then here you would paste the ARN of the Amazon resource name of the role that we created in the beginning, that SSM role that we created in the beginning. And that's it. You just click save and that's done. In the past, this would require you to write some Lambda functions and some code there to do this on your behalf, and it actually wasn't that difficult, but AWS config has updated and made this really easy where you do not have to know code at all to go ahead and implement this auto remediation and have a pretty robust security strategy. So let's pop back over to US East 1 to take a look at our rule sets and see if we're still in a bad situation over here with those misconfigurations that I went ahead and performed. So as you can see here now that it had a little bit of time to update, the console here shows that there are 4 non-compliant resources, which makes a ton of sense because we did disable public bucket and we did disable the block on public buckets and objects in those resources, as well as disabled default encryption. So let's just take a look at one of these rule sets. to see what's going on. So you see we have the 3 buckets. It gives you a good amount of information about what's the resource ID, what's the compliance status, and then this action status is important. So the fact that this says action executed successfully tells me that the auto remediation has already taken place, even though it's still showing up as non-compliant in this dashboard. Again, there's a delay between the actions that are taken and what's displayed here on the dashboard, but the fact that these action executed successfully is showing tells me that these buckets, when we pop over to S3, will no longer be public. And then let's take a look at encryption. So this is the encryption rule. Yep, action executed successfully. So let's pop over to S3 and see how great this is. So if you remember, we have the US East 1 buckets here. So if we just filter those by regions, you see we have these 4 buckets here, and they are all no longer public. All 4 buckets are no longer public, which AWS config went out and remediated for us. As well, if I pop into the properties here, encryption is now enabled again. And let me just check one more bucket that's in the US East 1 region. We'll check this last one. And encryption, default encryption is back enabled. So you can really see the power of config here. You can see that we were just over in another region performing some actions after we made some misconfigurations, and we came back and everything is now corrected. And you can see the power there of being able to identify misconfiguration and then ultimately fix it and receive some notifications about it. You saw what happens in Slack on the changes between compliant and non-compliant status. So hope this was helpful. Hope you're able to learn something and take it and go and implement in your environment. As always, if I made any mistakes or if you have anything to add, feel free to reach out, drop a note in the comments, or definitely subscribe to the channel as we continue to release these labs on a monthly basis to automate some key security best practices. Thanks for the time.